Today we started our quadratic unit, and mostly today we talked about some vocabulary, and then we focused on the graphs of quadratics and how to calculate your axis of symmetry and your vertex. So the first thing we want to talk about is standard form of a quadratic equation. So when you start working with a quadratic, what you want to do is you want to make sure it's written in the form of y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. Now, I'm using variables. I'm using the letter a, b, and c in the place of actual numbers. So the part that's going to be there is the y equals the x squared, the x, and then a possible constant. That's the number without a variable. So from this point, we talked about the graph of the graph of quadratics, which are called parabolas, which you've heard me use that vocabulary word before. And remember, a parabola is that U-shaped graph that occurs whenever you graph a quadratic equation. So what I'm going to start out with here is I'm going to give you two equations. We're going to start with y equals x squared plus 2x minus 5. And we're just going to kind of talk about the things that I just went over. So the first thing that I'm going to do is identify my a, which is 1. That's the number in front of x squared. B, which in this case is 2, because that's the number in front of x. And c, which in this case is negative 5. That's my constant. Now, we looked at this in a graphing calculator, and we kind of talked about what it looked like. So I'm not drawing this exact, but I am going to do a little sketch here. If I was to put this in y equals in my graphing calculator and graph this, I notice that my vertex occurs over here in quadrant 3, and that it crosses the x-axis over here on the right side, and then again on the left. Oh, that should be a U. Okay? Now, a few things that you should be aware of. Your a value, meaning that number in front of x squared, tells you whether your parabola is going to open up or down. If a is positive, so if a is positive, then your parabola is going to open up. Okay, like this one. If a is negative, it's going to open down. And we kind of talked, and I said, if a is positive, positive people smile. So your parabola opens up like a smile. And then if a is negative, then you're going to frown, or your parabola is going to open in a downward motion. So let me give you an example of that one. If we had y equals negative x squared plus 3x plus 7, and I asked you to graph that, then we looked at this one in our graphing calculator as well, and it looked similar to this. And when I identified my a, I noticed this time it's negative 1. B is positive 3, and C was 7. Okay, so over here, when a was negative, my parabola opened down. Okay? All right, so after we kind of just talked about the basics of a, b, and c, and we were able to identify them from equations, and we talked about, well, what do we know our graph is going to sort of look like? We know it's going to be a parabola. Is it going to open up or down? Then we moved into axis of symmetry and vertex. So we know that the graph of a quadratic equation is going to make this U-shaped graph, which we call a parabola. And two of the main things that we talked about today was the fact that a parabola, or this U, is symmetrical. Remember, symmetrical means that if I was to fold it in half on a specific line, then it would be a mirror image on the other side. And so what that does is it creates this point that has a line going through it. That point is called the vertex. It is the turning point of your parabola. And it's the only point on the graph that doesn't have a mirror image. The vertical line that passes through the vertex is called the axis of symmetry. And today, as we were doing this, I taught you that you could calculate your axis of symmetry by using the equation x equals the opposite of b divided by 2 times a. This formula not only gives me the axis of symmetry, but it also gives me the x-coordinate of my vertex, which we also calculated today. This formula is on your EOC formula chart. You just have to know how to use it and when to use it. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at an example. So when we started out, we looked at something like this. Y equals x squared plus 8x plus 15. So to start with, we identified A, which is 1, B, which in this case is 8, and C, which in this case is 15. Then using those values, we calculated our axis of symmetry. So I know that x is equal to the opposite of b. b in this case is 8, divided by 2 times a, which in this case was 1. Well, negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. So my axis of symmetry would be x equals negative 4. Well, since I know that the axis of symmetry passes through my vertex, I know that the x-coordinate of my vertex must also be negative 4. But if I'm looking for a point, I need a y value that goes with that. So I'm going to go back up to my equation, and I'm going to substitute negative 4 in for x. So I have y equals negative 4 squared plus 8 times negative 4 plus 15. So two things I want to point out. Number one, I took the equation exactly as it was written and I substituted in negative 4 for x. Notice that I put x inside parentheses when I substituted it in. That's important because that's going to affect your answer, because when you square a negative number, it becomes positive. Without the parentheses, it would be negative still. Okay? So then I put this into my calculator and I do the computation and I find out that y is actually equal to negative 1. So now I know my vertex is negative 4, negative 1. Now at this point, we just kind of sketched a graph. We didn't use our graphing calculator. We didn't, have a whole bunch of points, but we did include the two things that we just calculated. So when I am sketching my graph, the first thing I need to know is, well, is this parabola going to open up or down? So remember, you go back to your A value. A is positive. Therefore, I know that my graph must open up. I'm going to go ahead and label my vertex at negative 4, negative 1, because that's an important piece of information. And I'm going to go ahead and put my axis of symmetry on there and label it as x equals negative 4. Those are the only two things that I know about this graph at this point. Okay, I did want to do one example where you are missing B, so that if you had any questions on your homework, you were able to do that. So let's go ahead and look at one of those. So notice in this example, when you go to identify A, you get 1. But when you go to identify B, there's no x in this equation. So I know there are 0 x's. So that makes my B value 0. C is negative 3. That's my constant. In order to identify my axis of symmetry, I'm going to use the formula x equals negative b, which in this case, b happens to be 0, divided by 2 times a. Well, 0 divided by anything is just going to be 0. So my axis of symmetry would be x equals 0. What that tells me is that my parabola, the axis of symmetry, happens to be the y-axis. That's the line that's cutting my parabola in half. So now I need to calculate my vertex. So I have my x-coordinate, so I'm going back up to my equation and substituting that in. So y is equal to 0 squared minus 3. so y is equal to -3. That tells me that my vertex occurs at 0, -3, which should make sense since I just told you that the axis of symmetry is the y-axis. We would expect our vertex to be on the y-axis. In this case, A is positive, so I know my parabola opens up. I'm going to label my vertex, which is at 0, -3. I'm going to go ahead and dash in, ooh, that line was not straight, my axis of symmetry and label it at x equals 0. Okay, you do have homework. The homework is to complete 1 through 8 on the assignment. The first 5 is vocabulary review, and then you're going to calculate the axis of symmetry and vertex and sketch a graph on 6, 7, 8, 11, 13, and 15. If you have any problems or you have any questions, please come in for tutorials. I'll have a great weekend.